the Border Patrol and ICE becoming more and more like an interior enforcement, militarized, sort of like alongside the National Guard. We have to be conscious about tying that back to the sort of 9/11, post 9/11 era.
You're listening to Radio Free Mike. Welcome to Radio Free Mike, the podcast about freedom and its discontents. My name is Michael Scott Moore, and today we're talking to Francisco Cantú, author of The Line Becomes a River, his book about working for the Customs and Border Protection Agency in his first years out of college. Francisco grew up in Arizona, so the Mexican border's been on his mind for most of his life. But as you'll hear, he was an unlikely candidate to be a Border Patrol agent, which gives him a pretty good perspective for a memoir. We talk about that, as well as mission creep for migration enforcement away from the border and into American cities under Trump, as well as changes in border traffic since about 2006. Francisco, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So your book is terrific, and it describes your career as a Border Patrol agent and then some aspects of your life afterwards. Tell us about how you started at the Border Patrol. You signed up, I think in 2012, wasn't it?
I signed up in 2008 and left in 2012.
Left in 2012. Okay, yeah.
So I had probably what's a pretty uncommon path into the Border Patrol. I studied international relations as an undergrad. I'm from Arizona, but I went to school in DC. And during my undergraduate degree, I sort of like focused my international relations studies on the U.S.-Mexico border. It was sort of like a way of studying the place I came from through like the DC policy lens.
Right.
And I kind of felt after doing like 4 years of book learning about, border policy, and at that time, under the first George W. Bush, or was it the second George W. Bush tenure? It was like in 2006, I want to say, there were a lot of immigration protests around the nation. And
yeah, that was his second term. And I remember in 2006, because of midterms, a lot of talk about building the border wall. And I was in Berlin. I'm like, what just happened? Why is everybody talking about building a border wall all of a sudden?
Yeah. And actually, I think in like kind of like a kind of forgotten piece of that history of the George W. Bush administration, he had actually proposed a pretty like sweeping like immigration reform.
Yeah.
It was the first like big push for like a wholesale immigration reform by a U.S. president since like Ronald Reagan in 1986.
Right, including some amnesty, and that made him really unpopular on the right. But there was a lot of the push failed. Right, I don't think he really got too many of his changes through.
Yeah, it was a pretty spectacular failure. I would almost say like defeated more by the right than even on the Democratic side.
Yeah.
Anyway, I only bring up these things to sort of like create a picture of the environment at that time.
Yeah.
I was studying immigration and border issues. And I think that sort of the disconnect between the conversations that were happening at a national level, there was this push to build the wall. George W. Bush had made a big hiring push to hire more Border Patrol agents. So the Border Patrol was very much in the news. And although I was not a law enforcement minded type person, I was not on that side of the political spectrum. I thought as like a very naive and young early 20s coming out of my undergraduate degree, I was like, I want to like the only way to really see what's actually happening in this debate and like hold it up against all of these papers and books and conversations I've been reading and listening to and sort of living in this saturated environment. I was like, oh, I could go do this for a couple years as an extension of my education.
Yeah.
I think I imagined like, oh, I could become some, great immigration lawyer or policymaker with like a perspective that most people in that field lack. And
Right.
I also imagine like, oh, cool, like I'll be a force for, for good or for change on the inside
Within the agency.
during that time. Yeah, of
Hmm.
course, emphasis on the naivete of like a 20-year-old, 21, 22-year-old, whatever I was at the time.
And how did your mother feel?
Yeah, my mother is a big part of the book because I think she was sort of the biggest, most consistent voice that was sort of warning me against and kind of recognizing the naivete that I mentioned.
Hmm.
My mother, uh, when I grew up, she worked for the U.S. Park Service as a park ranger and had moved while I was still quite young to work for the U.S. Forest Service. So she had worked for the U.S. government most of her life, and I think had this experience of seeing how her sort of love and interest and passion for the outdoors really became funneled into these different sort of like administrative institutional aims.
Hmm.
And so I think that was sort of underneath a lot of her caution. And, frankly, at a lot of moments, just kind of telling me that you shouldn't do this.
Because she knew what it was like to work for the government.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so she's in the book as kind of that contradictory voice that's like, hey, this might not be what you expect.
Right.
Are you sure? Are you sure you want to do this? On and on. Yeah.
Right. Well, I have to say it's actually refreshing to hear something told from the inside of a government agency by just a different perspective than you might expect. From the Border Patrol has a certain reputation, but also at the same time, I have to say that in 2006, when you look at the statistics, that there really was a groundswell of people coming across the border. I don't think those numbers have been topped. Maybe in the last few years, again under Biden, but only maybe. It depends how you count, I think.
And it was a profoundly even if those Biden numbers, which I also don't have in front of me, even if those Biden numbers come close, it was a completely different kind of movement across the border.
What does that mean?
So in 2000, I think like beginning in 2005 is when this, sort of surge or increase in crossings, I think, started to go up. And I have become most interested in this time period because alongside of that increase in crossings is a really startling increase in border deaths. So people dying in the desert on the crossing. And we can get into what those crossings look like. But they were most of those crossings at that time, most of the traffic at that time was single men coming, labor migrants.
In 2005, 2006.
Yes, and largely from Mexico. The majority of them being
right.
single men from Mexico. Many of whom were engaged in sort of like cyclical migration, or many of whom had already roots and family in the United States, who maybe already traveled back and forth for different seasonal jobs. And as the border enforcement and infrastructure was kind of ramped up during that period, because you're right, after the Bush reelection, there was this push to sort of build more border infrastructure, more border wall. That's actually where you get like the first kind of build the wall.
Along narrative. The whole border. Yeah. That's what I remember.
There were, a series of, ever since like the late 80s, early 1990s, there had been, really significant increases in border policing in towns and cities, like major towns and cities, specifically like El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, San Diego, Tijuana. So those areas since the 80s and 90s had been really tamped down. Um, Before that crackdown, those towns and cities are where the majority of crossings took place. That's where
Right.
most people would come in and out. And after the buildup of border patrol in towns and cities, a lot of that traffic, a lot of those crossings began to happen further and further out into the desert. To avoid the enforcement, the heavy enforcement in the towns and cities. The Clinton administration, kind of formalized all this in 1994. There was a plan called, Prevention Through Deterrence. It was part of the Border Patrol's 1994 strategic plan, and it sort of like names these trends that we've been dealing with ever since. And the way that it sort of described this enforcement strategy is that if we tamp down the crossings in towns and cities where most of these people are moving through, they will be forced to make a more dangerous crossing through the desert, through mountains, through areas where there, are not population centers, are not, resources, and people, seeing the danger of those crossings will, cease to make those crossings. It'll kind of be like a problem that solves itself or whatever.
Right. And it didn't happen.
Yeah. And the evidence that it wasn't happening, was apparent right away.
Oh.
If you talk to policymakers or if you look at policymakers from that era who are looking back and talking in various, interviews or podcasts or whatever, a lot of them, they refer to this as kind of a unintended consequence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's, really important to interrogate that line, because the consequence became the deaths. The rise in deaths became apparent really quickly, within a decade. And so by 2005, the era that we sort of started talking about, those deaths started to really significantly increase, like hundreds a year in Arizona alone, in like Pima County alone, which is where I live in Tucson. And so those crossings through the desert, a lot of single men making those crossings. There was sort of a decade or more of, high individual crossings, lots of death, lots of people being pulled out of the desert, lots of, Border Patrol. At the time that I came in, I sort of was brought in by recruiters who really pitched the search and rescue side of the Border Patrol, and sort of pitched the Border Patrol as like, oh, like if you want to help migrants, this is the organization that rescues more migrants than anybody else, which is a really perverse line of a kind of perverse recruitment line, but it's one that, I don't know how active that is still, but it was really active at that sort of rhetorical line was really prominent, especially in like recruiting people from the border area and in recruiting Latinos.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but this has been a free preview of this episode. And the whole thing is open to paid subscribers to Radio Free Mike. So if you'd like to hear the rest, please hit the link in your show notes or in the body of the email we've sent you and upgrade your subscription over at Substack. Then you'll be able to listen to the full episode on any platform. Thanks for listening.
Beside